Liam Sterling stood before Marcus Thorne, a man who radiated the smug certainty of inherited wealth and tailored suits that cost more than Liam's first car. He was about to apologize for a sin he hadn't committed, a social infraction manufactured out of thin air, and he was doing it at the firm, insistent urging of his own wife, Chloe. The restaurant around them was a cathedral of modern cuisine, all polished chrome and hushed reverence, a place where the bill for four could finance a small-town library for a year. It was Marcus's natural habitat and Liam's personal circle of hell. What Chloe didn't know, what Marcus couldn't possibly fathom in his world of polished surfaces and transactional relationships, was that the quiet man before them, the man they both saw as a gentle, well-meaning failure, was now arguably one of the most powerful figures in their state. Tucked inside the breast pocket of his simple, off-the-rack blazer was a slim, leather-bound journal. To the casual eye, it was a simple affectation, an architect's sketchbook. But resting between pages of intricate designs and handwritten notes was his phone, and on its screen, an email confirmation that had arrived only 3 hours earlier. It was a message that detailed the final, official award of the $72 billion Project Horizon, the largest, most ambitious public infrastructure contract in the nation's history, to his small independent firm, Sterling Design. The apology rested on his tongue, a bitter, metallic taste. Before we see how this evening of quiet humiliation and explosive revelation unfolds, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Please take a moment to drop your city, your state, or your country in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy narratives where humility and integrity ultimately triumph over arrogance and pride, be sure to click that like button and subscribe to the channel. You truly will not want to miss what happens when the quietest man in the room finally decides to speak. Now, back to that gilded cage of a restaurant, where a storm was gathering under the soft, forgiving lights. The supposed offense had been trivial. As they were being seated, Liam had shifted to allow Chloe to slide into the booth, and in doing so, had brushed against Marcus's chair. He hadn't jostled it, hadn't caused a disturbance. It was the slightest of contacts, a ghost of a touch. Marcus, however, had reacted as if he'd been shoved, placing a theatrical hand on the table to steady himself and casting a look of pained annoyance toward Liam. "Whoa there, easy does it," he'd said, his voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of the surrounding tables. Liam had offered a brief, reflexive, "My apologies," but for Marcus, and more distressingly for Chloe, that wasn't enough. Chloe, her face tight with anxiety, had leaned across the table minutes later, her whisper a sharp, insistent hiss. "Liam, you need to properly apologize to him. You embarrass me. He thinks you're clumsy." The accusation, so baseless and yet so revealing of her priorities, had struck Liam with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't about the truth. It was about the perception. It was about placating Marcus Thorne, the ghost of her past and the yardstick against which she still measured success. So here he was, standing as requested, a performer in a play he had no desire to be in. Marcus looked up at him, a forkful of seared scallop halfway to his mouth, his expression one of bored expectation. He was enjoying this. The power to command an apology for nothing was a delicious appetizer. "Yes, Liam? Is there something you need?" he asked, the feigned innocence a masterclass in passive aggression. Liam's gaze was steady, his posture relaxed. He did not look like a man about to abase himself. He looked like a man observing a curious specimen under glass. "Marcus," he began, his voice even and clear, betraying none of the roiling frustration within. "I've been asked by my wife to extend a more formal apology for my earlier clumsiness. It was not my intention to jostle you so forcefully. I hope you can accept my sincerest regrets for the disturbance." The words were perfect. They were an apology, as Chloe had demanded, but they were also a subtle reframing of the event, a verbal mirror held up to Marcus's absurd overreaction. Jostle you so forcefully. The disturbance. He was technically apologizing for Marcus's own theatricality. It was a verbal chess move that Liam knew would sail right over Chloe's head, but would land, however softly, on Marcus's ego. Marcus, however, was too steeped in his own superiority to notice the subtext. He simply heard the word apology and savored his victory. He gestured magnanimously with his fork. Apology accepted, Liam. Water under the bridge. We all have our clumsy moments. He gave a small, condescending smile. Just try to be a bit more aware of your surroundings. This isn't a construction site. He turned his attention back to his fourth guest, his current girlfriend, a woman named Tiffany who seemed to exist solely as a beautiful, silent accessory. Chloe, meanwhile, exhaled a breath she seemed to have been holding since they arrived. She gave Liam a small, grateful nod, as if he had just successfully navigated a treacherous diplomatic incident. The look of relief on her face was more painful to Liam than Marcus's open contempt. It confirmed his deepest fear, that his wife saw him as a liability, a social project that needed careful management. He sat down, the leather of the booth cool against his back. He gave Chloe a non-committal smile and reached for his water glass. His fingers brushed against the blazer pocket containing his journal. The solid feel of it was an anchor in the turbulent sea of this dinner. It was his secret, his truth. The journal was a beautiful object, a gift from his late father, also an architect. It was bound in dark, supple calfskin, worn smooth at the corners from years of use. An elastic band held it shut, and a simple, blind-stamped S was the only marking on its cover. Inside, its pages were a controlled chaos of genius. There were breathtakingly elegant sketches of bridges that seemed to float on air, designs for public libraries that spiraled toward the sky like modern temples, and complex, layered schematics for urban green spaces. And amidst it all, in his neat, precise handwriting, were notes on materials, on load-bearing capacities, on the philosophical purpose of public space. For the last 6 years, this journal had been the repository for his work on Project Horizon. While other firms had thrown teams of hundreds at the proposal, Liam had worked mostly alone, fueled by coffee and an unshakable belief in his vision. He had refined, redesigned, and perfected his concept, a holistic plan for a series of interconnected, sustainable microcities that would revitalize a forgotten region of the country. It was a vision that integrated housing, transport, energy, and nature into a seamless whole. It was, he knew, the work of his life. And 3 hours ago, that life's work had been validated in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The email from David Harrison, the head of the Presidential Committee on National Infrastructure, had been concise and overwhelming. "Mr. Sterling," it began, "it is my profound honor to inform you that upon unanimous recommendation by the committee, and with the full endorsement of the President, your firm, Sterling Design, has been awarded the contract for Project Horizon. Your proposal was, without exaggeration, the most forward-thinking and deeply human architectural concept we have ever had the privilege to review. We look forward to changing the future with you." Liam had read the email 5 times in his quiet, modest office, the silence of the room buzzing with the enormity of the words on the screen. $72 billion. It wasn't the money that staggered him, though the figure was absurd. It was the scale of the trust, the validation, the opportunity to build not just buildings, but a legacy, a better world. He had wanted to call Chloe immediately, to share the monumental news, to hear her shout with joy, to feel them united in this incredible moment. But something had stopped him. A small, cold nod of apprehension. This dinner with Marcus, which she had been talking about for weeks. "It's a huge opportunity for you, Liam," she'd said, her eyes shining with a familiar, misguided enthusiasm. Marcus is so well connected. If you can just impress him, he could open so many doors for you. He hadn't had the heart to tell her that the doors Marcus could open were doors he had no interest in walking through. They led to glass and steel boxes for the wealthy, to soulless monuments of commerce. They were doors to a world he was actively working against. So he had held his tongue. He had decided to wait, to see how the evening unfolded. And now, sitting here, having been forced to apologize for nothing, he felt a grim, sorrowful certainty. He had made the right decision. This moment of humiliation was a necessary crucible, a final clarifying test of the ground on which his marriage stood. And he was beginning to suspect it was sinking sand. The conversation, steered masterfully by Marcus, inevitably turned to business. It was his favorite topic, for it was the arena where he felt most dominant, the source of his identity and his power. He began by recounting a recent victory, the acquisition of a prime piece of downtown real estate where he planned to erect another gleaming residential tower. He spoke of leverage, of zoning variances he'd negotiated, and of the astronomical prices the penthouse suites would command. It was a monologue of conquest, delivered with the casual arrogance of a man who had never known failure. "It's a simple formula, really," Marcus said, leaning back and swirling the deep red wine in his glass. "You identify what people with taste want, and you give it to them, at a premium. Exclusivity is the only currency that matters." He then turned his gaze to Liam, a surgeon preparing to make an incision. "So Liam," he said, his tone dripping with faux interest, "Chloe tells me you're an architect too. Still doing those little home renovations? Kitchens, extensions, that sort of thing?" The insult was perfectly crafted, designed to diminish Liam's profession to a hobby, a small-time trade. Chloe shifted uncomfortably, a flush creeping up her neck. She knew what Marcus was doing, but she was powerless to stop it, caught in the gravitational pull of his confidence. "I've moved into more commercial work recently," Liam replied, his voice a placid lake. He would not allow Marcus to see a single ripple of agitation. "Right now, I'm focused on a few large-scale proposals." This piqued Marcus's interest, but only as a new angle for attack. "Oh, anything I might have heard of?" "Probably not," Liam said. "It's mostly public sector work. I just submitted a bid for a significant public infrastructure project." Marcus's face broke into a wide, pitying smile. He actually laughed, a short, sharp bark that made Tiffany jump. "Public sector? Oh, Liam, my dear fellow, is there any money in that? I thought that was just a black hole of red tape, endless committees and union disputes." "You're a braver man than I." He leaned forward, adopting a conspiratorial, mentoring tone that was infinitely more insulting than his open mockery. "Listen, a man with your earnestness shouldn't be wasting his time on that nonsense. You need to be in the real world, where men build empires, where the game is played for real stakes." He took a sip of his wine, letting the silence hang for a moment before delivering what he imagined was a stunning act of generosity. "Tell you what," he said, looking from Liam to Chloe, "I'm always looking for talent. My firm, Thorn Development, we have a design department. It's mostly for interior layouts and facade consultations, but it's a foot in the door. I could probably find a spot for you, a junior designer role perhaps. The pay isn't great to start, but it's a stable paycheck. And you'd get to see how real projects get built." The offer hung in the air, thick and suffocating. It was an offer of vassalage, a chance to be a minor courtier in the kingdom of Marcus Thorne. To Liam, it was the most profound insult he had yet received. But Chloe didn't see it that way. Her eyes widened, not with horror, but with hope. A job. A real job at a prestigious firm. Stability. Connection. This was the door she had been dreaming of. She saw Marcus's offer not as an insult, but as a lifeline. Under the table, her foot pressed urgently against Liam's shin. It wasn't a kick of anger, but a frantic signal. "Say yes, for God's sake, say yes. Don't ruin this." Liam felt the pressure against his leg, and a wave of profound sadness washed over him. She had no idea what she was asking him to do. She was asking him to trade his soul for a salary, his vision for a cubicle. He looked at his wife, at the desperate plea in her eyes, and then he looked at Marcus, at the smug, predatory benevolence on his face. He knew this was a crossroads. He slowly withdrew his leg from the pressure of Chloe's foot. He placed his napkin on the table and looked Marcus directly in the eye, a faint, unreadable smile on his lips. "That is an extraordinarily generous offer, Marcus," he said, his voice calm and measured. Chloe's face lit up. She thought he was accepting. "However," Liam continued and her face fell, "I must respectfully decline. I'm deeply committed to my current path." Marcus's smile tightened. He wasn't accustomed to being refused, especially not by someone he considered so far beneath him. Liam's calm refusal was not interpreted as dignity, but as the foolish pride of a man who didn't know his place. "Committed to your path?" Marcus echoed, his voice taking on a harder edge. "And what path is that exactly? The path of noble poverty? The path of filling out government forms that go straight into the shredder?" "The path of building things that last," Liam said quietly. "Things that serve more than a balance sheet." This quiet statement of principle was to Marcus the ultimate act of defiance. The air at the table grew thick with unspoken hostility. The pleasant fiction of a friendly dinner had dissolved, revealing the raw, ugly framework of ego and resentment beneath. The temperature at the table dropped several degrees. Marcus, having been rebuffed, abandoned all pretense of mentorship and resorted to a more direct form of psychological warfare. His attacks became more personal, his verbal barbs aimed not just at Liam, but at the foundation of his life with Chloe. He steered the conversation back to their shared past, a landscape where he was the undisputed hero, and Liam was a late, and in his telling, lesser addition. "Remember that trip to Tuscany, Chloe?" Marcus began, his eyes fixed on Chloe, pointedly excluding Liam from the shared memory. "The villa I rented for your birthday, with the infinity pool overlooking the vineyards?" Chloe's expression softened, a wistful smile touching her lips. "Of course I do. It was beautiful." "I always told you," Marcus continued, his voice a low, intimate murmur that was somehow audible to everyone at the table. "You deserve the best, a life without compromise, a life where you don't have to worry about, well, about anything." The implication was brutally clear. He was contrasting the imagined, sun-drenched perfection of a life with him against the perceived gray reality of her life with Liam. He was painting Liam as the compromise, the source of her worry, the man who could not provide that life without limits. Liam watched his wife's face. He saw the flicker of longing in her eyes, the way she was momentarily seduced by the shimmering mirage of her past. She was caught in the undertow of Marcus's manipulative nostalgia, and in that moment, she wasn't seeing the dedicated, loving husband beside her. She was seeing the phantom of a life she'd been taught to covet. A look passed across her face as she glanced at Liam, a complex, painful mix of affection, frustration, and, most woundingly, a sliver of pity. It was the look of someone wondering if they had chosen the wrong path. That look was the deepest cut of all. Liam, however, remained a pillar of preternatural calm. He took a slow, deliberate sip of water. His mind became a detached observer, cataloging the scene with architectural precision. He noted the way the light from the ridiculously expensive chandelier caught the diamonds on Tiffany's wrist. He noted the fawning deference of the waiter as he refilled Marcus's wineglass, but bypassed Liam's water. He noted the faint, cloying scent of Marcus's cologne, a scent that screamed of money and arrogance. He was compiling a list, not a list of grievances fueled by anger, but a clear-eyed inventory of slights, a ledger of disrespect. This wasn't just about Marcus or this one disastrous dinner. It was the culmination of 1,000 tiny humiliations he had endured over the years from Chloe's family and their social circle. They were all disciples of the Church of Marcus Thorne, people who measured a man's worth by the brand of his watch and the size of his portfolio. They saw Liam's quiet nature as weakness, his lack of interest in social climbing as a lack of ambition, his focus on meaningful work as a quaint but unprofitable eccentricity. They had never truly seen him, and tonight he was realizing, with a pain that was sharp and clarifying, that his own wife was still, in some crucial way, one of them. The pace of the evening seemed to slow down. The ambient sounds of the restaurant, the low hum of other conversations, the distant clatter of plates from the kitchen, the soft jazz playing over the sound system, faded into a muted backdrop. Liam was in the eye of his own personal storm, a pocket of intense, quiet clarity before the inevitable tempest. He felt his heart rate steady. The anger and frustration he had felt earlier had coalesced into something harder, something more focused. Resolve. He was no longer just enduring. He was waiting. He had come into this dinner hoping to share a victory with his wife. He now understood he had to use that victory to teach her a lesson about value, about character, and about the man she had married but never truly understood. He looked across the table at Marcus, who was now laughing at some private joke with Tiffany, basking in the security of his own world. He looked at Chloe, who was staring down at her plate, lost in a reverie of what if. He knew the moment was approaching. The conversation would eventually circle back to the world of big business, to the grand stage where Marcus believed he was the star. And when it did, Liam would be ready. Not to argue, not to defend himself, but simply to state a fact. A fact so large, so world-altering, that it would shatter the entire foundation of this carefully constructed social hierarchy. The quiet before the storm was almost over. The conversation, as Liam had predicted, eventually circled back to the grand stage of citywide development. It was Marcus's home turf, and he couldn't resist the urge to pontificate, especially about the biggest prize of all, Project Horizon. He spoke about it with a proprietary air, as if his opinions were sourced from the very heart of the decision-making process. You know, this Project Horizon deal is the only thing anyone who matters is talking about, Marcus announced, capturing the table's attention once more. It's going to completely reshape the next 50 years for this entire region. My sources, he said, leaning in as if sharing a state secret, tell me it's a done deal. It's going to the usual consortium, a partnership between Omnicorp, Titan Global, and a few of the other Big Five firms. It's the only logical choice. You can't entrust a project of that magnitude, that complexity, to anyone else. A small, independent firm wouldn't even know how to fill out the paperwork correctly, let alone manage the logistics. He punctuated this pronouncement with a self-satisfied sip of wine. Then his eyes, glittering with malice, found Liam. The final, crushing blow was about to be delivered for his own amusement. "That's the project you mentioned earlier, isn't it, Liam?" he asked, his voice a weapon cloaked in velvet. "The public infrastructure one you put a bid on? A bit out of your league, don't you think?" He paused, letting the silence amplify his next words. He wanted the number to land with the force of a physical impact. "It's a $72 billion undertaking." He said the figure slowly, with a theatrical relish, as if the sheer sound of it was enough to annihilate a man like Liam. He sat back, a smug smile playing on his lips, anticipating Liam's flustered, embarrassed reaction. He expected him to shrink, to stammer, to retreat into silence. Chloe did exactly that. She physically cringed, sinking lower in her seat as if she could disappear into the plush upholstery. A wave of second-hand shame washed over her. Her husband, her gentle, dreaming husband, had naively put his little firm's name in the hat for the biggest project in the world. The absurdity of it was, in that moment, mortifying to her. She felt a desperate urge to protect him from his own folly. "Liam, maybe we shouldn't talk about work anymore," she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. "Let's just enjoy the rest of the evening." But Liam wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on Marcus. He slowly, deliberately set his water glass down on the table. The sound it made was not loud, but it was crisp, clear, and definitive in the sudden silence. It was the sound of a period at the end of a long, painful chapter. "On the contrary, Chloe," Liam said, and his voice was different. The quiet placidity was gone, replaced by a low, resonant authority that made even Tiffany look up from her phone. "I think we should talk about it." He turned his head slightly, his eyes locking with Marcus's. The faint, unreadable smile was gone, replaced by an expression of intense, focused seriousness. "You're right about a few things, Marcus," he began, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight that cut through the restaurant's low hum. "It is a $72 billion undertaking, and you're right that it requires a very specific, very powerful vision." He paused, letting his words hang in the air, pulling the tension at the table taut like a wire. Chloe held her breath. Marcus watched him, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. He had expected capitulation, not a lecture. The quiet bomb, insulated for hours by patience and dignity, was now primed. The countdown had reached 0. Liam was about to redesign the entire landscape of their lives. Liam leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. The posture was not aggressive, but it commanded the space. "The problem with the big 5 firms, the ones you admire so much, Marcus," he continued, his voice a study in controlled power, "is that their vision is limited by its very nature. They see projects in terms of concrete, steel, and quarterly earnings reports. They see profit margins and stakeholder value. They are builders of monuments to capital. But they don't see communities. They don't see the families who will live in the shadow of their towers. They don't see the child who needs a safe park to play in, or the elderly couple who needs accessible public transport. They have forgotten the human element." Marcus scoffed, a dismissive, guttural sound. "Oh, please, spare me the bleeding heart architect routine. This is the real world. You can't build a city on feelings." "No," Liam agreed, his gaze unwavering. "You can't. You build it on a foundation of empathy, foresight, and sustainable design. You build it with a soul." With a slow, deliberate movement, Liam reached into his blazer pocket. He withdrew the worn, leather-bound journal. He didn't open it. He simply placed it on the crisp, white tablecloth between his plate and Chloe's. It landed with a soft, final thud, a sound that seemed to absorb all the noise in the room. The journal, his symbolic object of hidden power, was now evidence. It sat there, a quiet, unassuming testament to 6 years of relentless, uncelebrated work. The Presidential Selection Committee, as it turns out, wasn't looking for another empire builder, Liam said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing them in. They were looking for an architect. The sheer audacity of the statement stunned Marcus into a momentary silence. He recovered quickly, his face darkening with anger. "What in God's name would you know about the selection committee? Did you read about them in a magazine?" Before Liam could answer, a new voice joined the conversation, a voice that was calm, warm, and carried the unmistakable timbre of genuine authority. "He knows quite a bit about them, actually." An older gentleman, impeccably dressed in a classic navy suit, had stopped at their table. He was in his late 60s, with a shock of silver hair and eyes that held a keen, intelligent light. Marcus's face froze. His jaw went slack. He recognized the man instantly, David Harrison, a former senator, now a senior advisor to the president and the public face of the National Infrastructure Committee. He was one of the most respected and influential men in Washington, a power broker whose calls were always taken. Chloe just looked confused, wondering who this distinguished man was and why he was speaking to her husband. Harrison, however, paid no attention to Marcus's shock or Chloe's confusion. His focus was entirely and respectfully on Liam. "Mr. Sterling," Harrison said, extending his hand. "Liam, I am so sorry to interrupt your dinner. I was dining with my wife across the room and I couldn't resist coming over." Liam stood and shook his hand firmly. "Mr. Harrison, it's a pleasure to see you again. No interruption at all." Harrison's smile was genuine. He clapped Liam warmly on the shoulder. "I just wanted to congratulate you again, in person. The official press release goes out at 6 a.m. tomorrow, but the news is already buzzing on the inside. The president is absolutely ecstatic about your designs for Project Horizon." He glanced at the journal on the table. "Your vision for a sustainable, human-centric city of the future, it's precisely what this country needs. It's what we were all hoping for, but didn't dare believe we would find." He turned his gaze briefly to the others at the table, his eyes sweeping over a dumbstruck Marcus and a pale, bewildered Chloe. "The official award ceremony is next week at the White House. My office will be in touch with yours to coordinate the details." The statement landed. Simple, devastating, final. The world tilted on its axis. Chloe stared, her mind struggling to process the impossible words she had just heard. Mr. Sterling, his office, the White House, Project Horizon. She looked from the powerful man beaming at her husband to the humble leather journal on the table, and then to Liam. Her Liam, the man she thought she knew, the man she had just pitied, the man she had just forced to apologize to the smug, preening fool sitting opposite them, who now looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. The entire structure of her reality had just been demolished and rebuilt in the space of 30 seconds. And the architect of it all was her own husband. The silence that descended upon the table was absolute, a vacuum where Marcus Thorne's colossal ego had once been. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, slack-jawed mask of disbelief. His arrogance, his defining characteristic, didn't just crack, it evaporated, leaving him exposed and small. He stared at Liam, truly seeing him for the first time, not as a social inferior, but as a figure of incomprehensible power who had been sitting across from him all night, absorbing his insults with the quiet patience of a god. David Harrison, a man skilled in reading the undercurrents of any room, sensed the immense tension. He was not a cruel man, but he was a just one, and he had been privy to the summary of the competing bids. With a slight, almost imperceptible narrowing of his eyes, he delivered the final, devastating blow, the moral mirror forced upon a man who had never had to look at his own reflection. "In fact, Mr. Thorne," Harrison said, his voice retaining its pleasant tone, which only made the words more cutting, "your firm was one of the finalists we rejected in the last round. A competent proposal from Thorne Development, to be sure, very adequate." The word adequate was delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. But it lacked soul. It was another monument to commerce. Mr. Sterling's proposal, on the other hand, will redefine urban development for the next century. It's a legacy project, not just a real estate deal. With that, Harrison gave Liam's shoulder another firm, congratulatory squeeze. "My best to your wife," he said, giving a polite, distant nod to the shell-shocked Chloe. "I'll see you in Washington, Liam." And then he was gone, gliding through the restaurant, leaving a crater of stunned silence in his wake. For a long moment, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The only sound was the faint, distant clinking of cutlery from other, happier tables. Marcus opened and closed his mouth, making a dry, clicking sound like an insect. The power dynamic had not just been inverted, it had been annihilated. The king was a jester, and the fool was the king. It was Chloe who broke the spell. Her voice was a ragged whisper, laced with awe and a dawning, sickening horror at her own behavior. Liam, she began, her eyes wide and pleading. $72 billion? dollars? You, you won? The whole thing? She couldn't finish the sentence. The scale of it was too vast, a number her mind couldn't properly grasp. But she could grasp the implication. The man she had belittled, the man whose ambition she had doubted, the man she had tried to mold into a more acceptable form, had just achieved something beyond her wildest, most materialistic dreams. And he had done it without any of the things she valued, without connections, without flash, without the approval of men like Marcus. Liam finally turned to look at her, and his expression was not one of triumph or, "I told you so." It was one of profound, heartbreaking sadness. "Yes, Chloe," he said softly, "I won." Marcus, flailing in the wreckage of his shattered reality, made a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of control. He tried to dismiss it, to frame it as an impossibility. "This is a joke," he stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "It has to be. A prank. You? How could you? How?" The question, how, hung in the air, a testament to the sheer, blinding arrogance that still lingered. And it was that question that finally unlocked the icy calm Liam had maintained all night. He turned his full, undivided attention to Marcus, and the list of grievances, the silent inventory of insults, was finally brought forth for accounting. "How?" Liam's voice was low, but it vibrated with an intensity that made Marcus flinch. "I'll tell you how. By working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for the last 6 years on a proposal you couldn't conceive of in a lifetime. By reading books on sociology, sustainable agriculture, and public policy instead of shareholder reports. How? By focusing on substance instead of status. By believing that the purpose of architecture is to serve people, not to decorate the portfolios of the wealthy. While you were leveraging debt to build another glass box for people who own 5 other homes, I was designing a city for people who just want one decent one. While you were schmoozing city officials for zoning variances, I was meeting with community leaders to understand their actual needs." He leaned forward, his eyes like chips of blue ice. "You ask, how? I did it by being everything you are not. And the future you were so certain you owned, the one you were condescending to me about from your throne of inherited money, I just bought it, and I designed it. And your company, Thorn Development, will now be one of dozens of firms begging my new chief of staff for the privilege of bidding on a subcontract to pave the sidewalks." Marcus recoiled as if physically struck. He attempted a laugh, but it came out as a strangled, pathetic gasp. His mind, wired for opportunism, scrambled to find a new angle, a way to salvage something from the ruins. If you can't beat them, join them. He shifted gears with a whiplash-inducing suddenness, his face contorting into a mask of avaricious bonhomie. "Well, Liam, my boy," he boomed, his voice painfully false. "You sly dog! You should have said something. This is incredible. We should celebrate." He raised his wine glass in a toast that nobody joined. "Listen, this changes everything. We should partner up. My connections, my firm's logistical prowess, combined with your vision. Think of it. We could control the entire project. We could make a fortune." The desperation was palpable. He was no longer the king offering a courtier's position. He was the beggar pleading for scraps from the new emperor's table. Liam looked at him, and the icy intensity in his eyes was replaced by something far more chilling. Pure, unadulterated pity. It was the same emotion Chloe had shown him earlier, now reflected back at its source, magnified 1,000 times. "The time for partnership, Marcus, if it ever existed, is long, long past," Liam said, his voice flat and final. "You weren't looking for a partner tonight. You were looking for a subordinate to humiliate so you could feel powerful. The only thing you're connected to is an outdated idea of success. My project, the real Project Horizon, has no place for that. He dismissed Marcus with a final, withering glance, then turned to the true source of his pain. He turned to Chloe. The hardness in his expression dissolved, replaced by a deep, resonant sorrow that was far more damning than any anger. "And you," he said, his voice quiet again, but every word a precisely placed stone on her conscience. "You sat here and you watched him do it. You didn't just watch, you encouraged it. You were more concerned with the impression I was making on him than the impression his contempt was making on me, on us." He looked directly into her eyes, forcing her to confront the truth she had tried so hard to ignore. "You asked me to apologize to him. You asked me to shrink myself, to make myself smaller so that your past could feel large. You asked me to betray my own dignity to polish his ego." Chloe's face crumpled. The dam of her carefully constructed composure broke, and silent tears of shame, regret, and dawning self-awareness streamed down her cheeks. "Liam, I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "I didn't know. I was so stupid. I was blind." "I know you were blind," Liam said, and the softness in his voice held no comfort, only a sad confirmation of the fact. "That is the entire problem." With a quiet grace, he stood up from the table. He looked down at the leather journal, his life's work, sitting there as a silent witness. He left it there. Then he looked at Chloe, at the wreckage of their evening, at the chasm that had opened between them. "I need to go," he said simply. "I have an early morning. There's a lot to do." He didn't say, "Let's go." He didn't offer her a hand. He didn't issue an ultimatum. He simply stated his own intention and left the choice, and all of its crushing weight, entirely to her. He turned and walked away, his back straight, his stride even and sure. He didn't look back. Chloe was left sitting at the table, trapped in the unbearable silence between two men, in two worlds. One was the hollowed-out shell of the man she thought was a giant. The other was the quiet, unassuming man she had just discovered was a titan, and he was walking out of her life. The choice was hers to make: stay in the ruins or find the strength to follow the architect of the future. 3 weeks passed. The world had changed. The 6 a.m. press release had detonated in the financial and political world like a supernova. "Unknown architect wins $72 billion Project Horizon contract," the headline screamed. "David dares Goliath. Sterling Design's human-centric vision shakes up industry." Liam Sterling became an overnight sensation, but not in the way he had feared. The media narrative, guided by David Harrison's carefully worded statements, wasn't about the money. It was about the vision. He was portrayed not as a new billionaire, but as a revolutionary thinker, a quiet genius who had outmaneuvered the corporate giants, not with power, but with purpose. Liam's new reality was headquartered in a sprawling, light-filled office on the 45th floor of a downtown skyscraper. He hadn't chosen the flashiest building, but the one with the best views of the diverse neighborhoods his project would serve. The space itself was a reflection of his philosophy: minimalist, functional, and beautiful, with clean lines, natural materials, and vast open spaces that encourage collaboration. He was currently in the main conference room, a glass-walled enclosure overlooking the city, meeting with the core team he had begun to assemble, a collection of the brightest young minds in engineering, urban planning, and environmental science, all of them drawn by his vision. The fallout for Marcus Thorne had been swift and brutal. Harrison's public comments about Thorne Development's adequate but soulless proposal had been quoted in every major publication. The story of the upstart visionary toppling the established tycoon was too good to resist. Thorne Development's stock plummeted over 30% in a week. Lenders grew nervous. Investors began asking hard questions. Marcus's reputation as an infallible dealmaker was shattered. In the elite clubs and restaurants where he once held court, He was now the subject of whispered jokes and pitying glances, a fate for him worse than financial ruin. In a brief, pathetic epilogue to their dinner confrontation, Marcus had spent a week trying to get a meeting with Liam. He had called the new office of Horizon Development Authority a dozen times. He had sent pleading, then demanding emails. Finally, he had shown up in person, only to be politely but firmly stopped at the reception desk by Liam's new chief of staff, a formidable woman who had once been a senior city planner. She had listened to his blustered pitch about synergy and logistical support with a patient smile before handing him a standard vendor application form. Mr. Sterling is implementing a blind review process for all subcontractors to ensure fairness and quality, Mr. Thorne, she had said, her tone making it clear that his name would grant him no special favors. We encourage you to apply like everyone else. Defeated, Marcus had retreated, the paper in his hand feeling as heavy as a tombstone. And Chloe? For 3 weeks, Liam had heard nothing. He had returned to their shared apartment that night to find it empty. He had packed a bag and moved into a hotel, leaving her a simple text. I need some space. I'm safe. He had left the choice entirely in her hands, and her silence was its own kind of answer. He was prepared to accept that their marriage was another casualty of that night. Then one afternoon, she appeared at his new office, unannounced. The receptionist called him, her voice hesitant. Mr. Sterling, your wife is here to see you. Send her in, he said, his heart a sudden, heavy drum in his chest. She walked into the conference room, and he saw immediately that she was different. The expensive, status-conscious clothes were gone, replaced by simple jeans and a plain sweater. The perfectly coiffed hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. The biggest change was in her eyes. The anxiety and social calculation were gone, replaced by a quiet, humbled clarity. She wasn't the same woman from the restaurant. She clutched a large manila folder to her chest like a shield. Liam, she said, her voice soft but steady. I know you're busy. I won't take much of your time. He gestured to one of the chairs. Chloe, sit. She shook her head. No, I'd rather stand. She took a deep breath. I don't expect you to forgive me. Not now, maybe not ever. What I did, how I acted, it was unforgivable. I spent the last 3 weeks thinking about that night, but more than that, thinking about the last 5 years. And I realized I was the one who was a failure, not you. Her voice broke for a moment, but she mastered it. I was so blinded by the world I grew up in, the world of Marcus Thorne, that I couldn't see the incredible man standing right in front of me. I valued all the wrong things. I am so sorry. Liam listened, his expression unreadable. He had imagined this conversation 100 times, but her raw, unvarnished honesty was more powerful than anything he had anticipated. She held out the folder. I know apologies are just words, she said, so I've been trying to do something. I quit my job. He was surprised. She had loved her PR job, which catered to luxury brands and high-net-worth individuals. And, she continued, opening the folder to show him the contents, I've enrolled in an online master's program, Urban Planning and Community Development. She showed him the course list, the registration confirmation. I don't want to be a spectator in your life anymore, Liam, and I don't want to be a liability. I want to understand. I want to learn to see the world the way you see it. I want to be a partner you can be proud of, not just a wife who needs to be managed at dinner parties. She looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, but also with a new, fierce determination. I'm not asking you to take me back. I'm just telling you that I'm going to do this work. For me, and if one day you think I've earned it, I'd like to try to be a part of your world again, the real one. Liam took the folder from her. He looked at the course list, then back at her face. He saw not the ghost of Marcus's influence, but the first, authentic draft of a new Chloe. The road ahead would be long. Trust, once shattered, had to be rebuilt brick by brick. But for the first time since that night in the restaurant, he felt a flicker of hope. He saw the foundation of something new, something real. Months melted into a year. The name Liam Sterling became synonymous with innovation and integrity. He was on the cover of Time, Forbes, and Architectural Digest, not pictured on a yacht or in a flashy suit, but on site, wearing a hard hat, his sleeves rolled up, talking with engineers and construction workers. The narrative held, he was the visionary, the man who cared more about people than profits. Project Horizon broke ground, not with a single self-congratulatory ceremony, but with dozens of smaller events in the communities it would directly impact. It was a project that began from the ground up, creating thousands of jobs and a palpable sense of hope in a region long neglected. Liam, for his part, remained unchanged by the fame. He was still the same quiet, focused man. He deflected praise, always redirecting it to his team and the communities they served. The immense wealth the project generated was largely funneled into a charitable foundation he established to fund arts and education in underserved areas. He lived comfortably, but not extravagantly. His true wealth was the realization of his vision. Chloe kept her word. She disappeared into her studies with a ferocious dedication Liam had never seen in her. She excelled, her practical background in communications giving her a unique perspective on community outreach and public engagement. She started a blog, a well-researched and passionately written journal about the challenges and triumphs of modern urban renewal. It gained a respectable following, praised for its sincerity and sharp insights. She never mentioned Liam or her connection to Project Horizon. It was her own work, her own voice. They began to talk, cautiously at first. Phone calls became coffee. Coffee became quiet dinners at the small, unpretentious neighborhood restaurants they had frequented in their early years together. There was no grand scene of reconciliation. Instead, there was a slow, methodical rebuilding of a foundation. He saw her wrestling with her new knowledge, her face lit with excitement as she talked about mixed-use zoning or the importance of third spaces. She was not just learning a subject, she was learning his language. She was learning to see. One crisp autumn afternoon, Liam found himself with a rare few hours of free time. On an impulse, he drove to a small, unassuming park in a working-class neighborhood on the east side of the city. It was one of his earliest solo projects, completed years ago for a shoestring budget, mostly as a pro bono service to the community. It had no grand fountains or dramatic sculptures. It had a well-designed playground full of laughing children, sturdy benches positioned to catch the afternoon sun, a community garden tended by elderly residents, and winding paths that were gentle on the knees. It was simple, human, and full of life. It was the kind of work Marcus Thorne would have mocked as a sentimental waste of time. He was sitting on one of the benches, watching a group of teenagers play basketball, when he saw her walking toward him. He hadn't told her he was coming here. "How did you find me?" he asked, a small smile on his face. "I read an article about your early work," Chloe replied, sitting beside him, leaving a respectful space between them. "It mentioned this park. It said you called it your thesis on kindness. I wanted to see it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the vibrant life of the park unfold around them. "It's beautiful, Liam," she said finally. "It's not grand, but it's perfect. Every detail feels like it was designed with a person in mind." She began pointing things out, not as an amateur, but as a peer. The way this path curves to preserve that old oak tree, the placement of the water fountains near the play area in the garden, the recycled materials for the benches. It's all here, isn't it? The entire philosophy of Project Horizon, right here in this little park. He looked at her, and the last wall around his heart dissolved. She saw it. She finally, truly saw it. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers intertwined with his, a natural, familiar fit. The past year had not been an erasure of their history, but a profound editing. The painful chapters were still there, but they were now contextualized by a new, more hopeful narrative. His internal monologue, once a lonely space of observation, now felt like a dialogue he could share. He thought about the nature of true worth, how it had nothing to do with the noise of applause or the glitter of wealth. It was in the quiet dignity of a well-laid brick, a thoughtfully designed public space, a life dedicated to creating more than you consume. Arrogance, like Marcus's, built walls to keep people out. Vision, he now knew with certainty, built bridges to let people in. The journey had been painful, the cost high. But here, in this small park, holding the hand of the woman who had traveled all the way back to him by first finding herself, Liam felt a sense of peace that was more valuable than any contract. It was the feeling of being truly, and finally, home. Liam learned that true strength isn't about the triumphant moment of winning a confrontation, but about having the unwavering integrity to not become the very thing you fight against. He had vanquished arrogance without becoming arrogant himself. Chloe learned a harder lesson, that the brightest, most seductive lights can sometimes cast the darkest, most deceptive shadows, and that a person's true value is often quiet, patient, and waiting to be seen with clear eyes. They both learned that a real partnership isn't built on shared success, but on the shared willingness to grow, to forgive, and to rebuild. What do you think is the hardest lesson for a person to learn? That you were profoundly wrong about someone else, or that you were profoundly wrong about yourself? I would be fascinated to read your thoughts on that in the comments below. Thank you for being here with us for this story today. If you found value in this journey of humiliation, revelation, and redemption, please consider clicking that like button and subscribing to the channel for more stories that champion the quiet heroes and the enduring power of integrity. We appreciate your time and your attention more than you know. We'll see you next time.